Now, Zennon, if I could turn to you first. We are talking about China and India. They're very different markets in the fintech world. And you've been in Shanghai for, what, 12 years now? Before you became, well, a consultant and expert and analyst in this sector, you were at Intel, you were at Citigroup. You know, you've got all sorts of different perspective on this. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in China at the moment, because as far as I can understand it, it's dominated very much by three main companies, isn't it?
Sure. So, I mean, I got to China in 2004, and China actually at the time had what I considered the first form of mobile payments, and that was basically, I went to my bank, I took my money out in a paper bag, and I walked it across the street to my landlord's bank. And at the time, just over 10 years ago, that was the only option for making payments between banks. And we fast forward to today, and I pay my staff using Alipay, I pay my friends using WeChat Pay, and I invested in a financial product from Baidu. So I think what's interesting in China is, as you rightly point out, the scale of what's happening there. I mean, you have three companies that are in many respects dominating financial services, and really, you know, I consider what's happening in China Fintech, it may not be the largest in terms of the number of companies that are involved, but the impact that these companies are having on the average consumer and the average business in China, in my opinion, far outweighs anything else that we're seeing globally.
So those companies you mentioned are Alibaba and the various different versions thereof. Yeah. What are the other two?
Baidu and Tencent, collectively called the BAT.
Those three dominating. Mostly we're talking, as you say, sort of ways of transferring money between different sections of the population. And they have taken away a lot of revenue, haven't they, from the traditional banking sector already?
Yeah. So we did a study at the beginning of this year, and we looked at 2015, and we calculated, I think it was $22 billion was taken away from the traditional banks just in the payments business. So if you look at where these companies have come from, I mean, Alibaba clearly is e-commerce player. And so they created the Alipay platform to facilitate payments, working similarly to an eBay and PayPal originally. And then Tencent brought payments into its platform, and then Baidu has gotten involved in the funds. So yeah, these companies the impact is really unique, because if you think about just taking as an example the Baidu fund. So the Baidu fund, if you haven't heard about it, I'd suggest you look it up. It's the BaiFa 100. And basically what it does is it takes consolidated search information, anonymized, but consolidated search information from the Baidu search engine. And if you're not familiar with Baidu, Baidu has the search functionality of a Google, essentially, but for China. So it takes that information, combines it with the CSI 100, which is the Shanghai index, and created a financial product. That product, which was a $3 billion product, was sold out in a matter of days. And the concept of a Google doing that here in the UK or in the US, it would be nearly impossible to see a tech company kind of reverse itself into financial services in the way that these companies have done. And that impact is really, I think we're seeing the first phase of that in China now, and some of these companies are now investing in India, especially Alibaba. I think the next wave or the next phase we'll see is them coming into markets, here in Europe. I mean, just last week at Money 2020, Alipay announced that they were enabling merchants across Europe, and the impact of that, not just for the Chinese tourists that are traveling abroad, but eventually into these other markets, is pretty incredible.
Now, I want to talk about some of the challenges facing fintech in China in a moment, but first, Alok, let's talk a little bit about India. Now, you are chairman of Rainmaking Innovation. You're leading the bridge between the UK and India in terms of sort of government fintech collaboration. In some ways, as I understand it, fintech in India is one of the best kept secrets of the business, isn't it?
It certainly appears to be, because it wasn't in the EY report that was published recently. So that is one of the reasons I'm here, because I said if nobody recognizes that India is becoming a reasonably strong center for fintech in the world, why isn't it being acknowledged as such? I think what is happening in India is India's been dominant in technology services companies. What is happening is with the transformation to digital, these companies are looking to actually become more and more product-driven. And across technology, I believe India will become a product-driven technology nation. Financial services are 40%. I believe more macro than my friend here about the three companies in China. Financial services are 40% of the Indian economy, certainly the Indian market cap. And what is happening there, therefore, is with the penetration of telecom and mobile, which is now 90% of that 1.2 billion population, the game has changed for India. And there is a very strong reform-driven agenda, which is to include and basically empower the population, the whole population, into the banking sector, increase financial savings, deliver credit to the unbanked as well. And what has happened is we heard in the earlier session as well, in the inclusion session, which is very good, is because of UID, which is Aadhaar, which allows you to biometrically identify the population. The KYC is now up to around 800 to 900 million people in India. There has been a platform developed which takes away the ability, that actually builds the ability for everybody in the banking and financial system to plug in, and therefore payments become seamless. The government's using that platform already. So I think there is a lot happening in fintech on the payment space. Where I think fintech is different from the rest of the world here is, I think in the developed world, and London's by far, to me, the leading center, and I'll come back to that in terms of the UK-India bridge, is that the collaboration between the Indian bank and the Indian financial services companies and the entrepreneur is actually a reality in India today. The banks are young, the bank managements are young, the advent of technology within banks is very strong, and they're happy to go collaborate. What I'm doing, one of the things I'm doing is I'm working with Startup Bootcamp to get them into India. Why are they coming into India? Whereas 4 months ago, they weren't thinking about it. Because when they were populating their cohort in Singapore, 65% of the applications for Singapore came from India. Now, that's a big number. And these weren't ridiculous applications. These were high-quality applications. So I think that changed the mind for this global accelerator, Startup Bootcamp, to actually come into India. And that is proof of some element of proof that there is a lot happening across fintech in India.
Mm. You mentioned the very different worlds that you guys inhabit in terms of the sort of the cityscape, if you like, of fintech in China is so different from what you've just described, Alok. Things are changing rapidly, you were mentioning to me before, particularly around the regulatory structure, which presumably could slow things down a tad. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think China, I mean, if you look at the economy, I mean, there's lots of similarities between the two countries. Controlled currency, at least in China, heavily regulated. It's not so much regulation, but the availability of products within the financial industry doesn't really compare to some of the more mature markets. And so now we're seeing things like peer-to-peer lending, mobile payments. There's very little regulation around these platforms until very recently. And so for a long time, and if you look at peer-to-peer lending as an example, I mean, shadow banking and shadow lending has been a big challenge in China for many years. So peer-to-peer lending platforms don't necessarily take that risk out of the system, but they make it more transparent. So in a lot of ways, although peer-to-peer lending platforms have been in place since about 2010, at least online in China, it's only the end of last year, beginning of this year, that we're starting to see regulations around that. But at the same time, I mean, the government wants to encourage innovation. So if you see a lot of the things, there's a lot of funding around fintech right now. Just over the past couple of weeks, they set up a regulatory body that's going to be focused on internet finance. So it's this kind of push-pull. I mean, they want to control the risk of some of these platforms and some of the innovation, but they recognize China needs to mature as a financial industry. So they need to open things up for a lot of these players like the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, that are really pushing the industry forward. They need to enable that as well. So it's a very delicate balance for the government right now and the regulators in China, certainly.
And Alok, as the world's spotlight is now beginning to find its way to India in terms of the fintech business, what do you think the best opportunities are going to be for people here who are now perhaps from hearing you today thinking, oh, actually, well, let's take a look at India. What should they be looking at?
I think there's a huge amount of opportunity from both sides. From here, I think India is going to be a very large market, not just for the unbanked, but across the mainstream of the population as well. So I think things like robo-advisors, things like peer-to-peer, credit delivery, and the more esoteric stuff around blockchain as well will all come into play, and there will be a market out there, and I believe that there is a case for joint venturing in the future. The other way around is London is the best fintech destination jurisdiction in the world with a very forward-looking regulator. So I think for the Indian entrepreneur, it allows the settling down of a business in the UK with an eye to the world as well. And I think the relationship between the UK and India can develop through a government-to-government interaction, because I think this whole industry is also regulatory dominated. And I think there's a lot that India can learn from the regulator in the UK, inasmuch that there is a lot, because of this whole UID thing and the whole KYC thing, that the world can learn from India as well.
Are entrepreneurs in the fintech world in China looking for investment from people in the UK?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're working on in China is we've set up, and I'd encourage anybody who's interested in this, ChinaFintech.com, and we're trying to basically create an ecosystem that we feel hasn't existed in China. So there are a lot of incubators, there are a lot of accelerators in China, but they tend to be more horizontal focused. They don't tend to be very verticalized around that. So what we're trying to do is bring a little bit more structure around that, because one of the things that's missing is that you have the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, but then you have this large tranche of fintech startups, and there are some very interesting models out there. I was talking to a fintech last week, and their model is, there's a tremendous number of migrant workers that come into the big cities to work because of the money. And so this company actually, when a migrant worker comes in, they will give them 1,000 renminbi, so say about 100 pounds, to buy a mobile phone. And that is paid back in 1 year at 70% interest, which seems huge, but for that migrant worker coming into one of the big cities, that's a tremendous boon, and they're very much able to pay that back at the end. So there's this smaller grouping of incredibly innovative ideas that really match the market, that don't necessarily have the access to the resources that they need. So that's certainly something I think that companies are open for investment, they're open for learning and potentially even expanding outside of China in the future.
And we have just 1 minute, Alok, for you to sort of put your best foot forward for the Indian fintech world. What do you think the big opportunities are going to be there for the UK in the next 5 years? What are we going to see explode?
I think it's going to be across the board. It's very difficult to pinpoint what will actually be an opportunity. The market it's not 1 billion people, but it's certainly 300 to 400 million people. And whatever works here will work also in India. So I think there is an opportunity out there to enter the market.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for, I know we could carry on. I know we'd like to hear more, but we have to call it a day. Thank you very much indeed.